My name is Gretchen Minton, and I'm from Montana State University, Bozeman, Montana, USA. In recent decades, actors playing the title role in Timon of Athens have spent much of the second half of the play standing knee or waist deep in a pit, so often, in fact, that the character begins to look like an angry version of Hamlet's gravedigger. This staging seems appropriate, for Timon has dug his own grave in a metaphorical sense, behaving in a financially irresponsible manner and misjudging everyone around him. On a more literal level, his frantic digging for food turns into a desire to seek death through a return to Mother Earth. Ultimately, such digging taps into the fantasy of connection to nature, even as it acknowledges the fact that our tendency to dig is a fundamentally destructive act that bears the indelible mark of the Anthropocene. In 2019, I adapted Timon of Athens, setting it in Montana in the northern U.S. Rockies. This adaptation, entitled Timon of Anaconda, foregrounds the links between economic and ecological systems in Montana, a state that was first settled by white people because of gold mining, built into an economic powerhouse because of copper mining, and continues to be one of the top coal producers in the U.S. The Timon of Anaconda adaptation sought to revitalize and reclaim the early modern text, the performance sites, and the community ethos of environmental stewardship. The city of Butte in southwest Montana was dubbed the richest hill on earth in the late 19th century because of its immense deposits of ore. After decades of digging tunnels to excavate the copper and other minerals, the powerful Anaconda Mining Company turned to open-pit mining in the mid-1950s. When the resources of Butte proved less lucrative, Anaconda shut down that mine, leaving a giant chasm in what was once the richest hill on Earth. The Berkeley Pit measures 7,000 feet in length by 5,600 feet in width. When the mining operation was discontinued, the pumps stopped running, and subsequently the pit filled with groundwater and rain that created a highly toxic lake, laden with arsenic, zinc, and sulfuric acid at a depth of 1,780 feet. The pit, along with the stretch of Deer Lodge Valley in which Butte is located, is the largest EPA Superfund site in the U.S. The sobering fact is that no one knows how to clean up the damage, and soon the pit's water is predicted to contaminate Silver Bow Creek, and thus the entire water table, a process accelerated by rising temperatures due to climate change. Meanwhile, the impact of the toxins on wildlife is startlingly apparent. Several times, flocks of snow geese have landed on this artificial lake and died, their white feathers stained by the red-orange acidic liquid that they mistook for life-sustaining water. The boom and bust economy of Butte, as well as its record of environmental catastrophe, have made it the subject of much attention. It is all too easy to point fingers at Butte and to use this place as an object lesson about human errors. But such narratives are oversimplified and ultimately unhelpful when considering the effectiveness of environmentally inflected theater for making a difference in our world. A similar point is made by Timothy LeCain in his book Mass Destruction, which offers an instructive look at Butte's history from an environmental, technological point of view. He argues that we should resist a too facile framing of Butte's environmental history as merely a morality play on the evils of early 20th century corporate capitalism, because such a simple declensionist tale tends to obscure other important aspects of the story that offer more useful lessons for understanding the human relationship to the environment. As a resident of Montana, I find myself drawn to Butte's story. Thus, I seek ways to talk about its past and potential futures. Like many others, I believe in employing Shakespearean texts to negotiate the myriad issues facing us today, and my foremost concern is the environment. The excavation of a Shakespearean text to talk about the excavation of the earth in Montana offers a provocative synergy for Shakespearean adaptation. My aims are rooted in the practice of eco-dramaturgy, an important ethical movement that calls for more environmentally conscious theatrical practices. In the words of Theresa May, Eco-dramaturgy puts ecological reciprocity at the center of its theatrical and thematic intent, thereby seeking to break down the binaries between nature and culture, hope and despair, the individual and the community. Timon of Anaconda is set in the period roughly from the late 1960s to the early 1980s. The scale of open-pit mining changed everything in Butte, most significantly the pace of environmental impact and the rate at which the neighborhoods were destroyed to accommodate an ever-increasing area for mining. This adaptation does not merely replay the horrors of the past, however, but instead seeks to articulate the network of human and non-human systems that both created and have been impacted by this history. In this adaptation of the Shakespeare Middleton play, Timon is reimagined as a mining mogul from the Anaconda Copper Company. Timon begins with the naive belief that all segments of Butte's society are fundamentally connected in positive ways. But in the wake of his financial destruction and his friends' refusal to help him, he attempts to sever human connection by retreating to the wilderness outside of Butte. Yet the more Timon seeks to isolate himself, the more he realizes that he cannot extract himself from human networks that mercilessly exploit the earth. He still uses the tools of civilization. His spade and pickaxe aid his desperate digging of roots, and the gold that he unearths comes in the form of green-tinted rocks, suggesting the copper veins of mineral-rich earth. The military general Alcibiades in the original became a mining foreman in Timon of Anaconda. Alcibiades' loyalties clearly lie with Butte's rank-and-file miners. However, he is too short-sighted to see that the environment created by unbridled capitalism and exploitation of natural resources will shortly cause the collapse of Butte's economic and ecological systems. The cynic Epaminondas in Timon of Athens is an outspoken critic of flattery and hypocrisy, and this main character trait is carried over into the adaptation, where Epaminondas is envisioned as a Montana woodsman who spends most of his time living off the land as if he were an old-time mountain man. His desire to live in accordance with nature seems commendable at the outset of the performance, but his rants are suggestive of self-righteous environmentalism. Along with the other servant characters, the steward represents the central possibility of hope in Timon of Anaconda. This character was modeled upon Rachel Carson, and she is, in every sense of the word, a steward, taking care of both human and non-human environments. Not only does the steward portray a genuine concern for her master throughout, but she has the greatest ecological sensibility, offering not money but food, not flattery but empathy. Timon of Athens is a suggestive text for ecological adaptation for many reasons, not the least of which is the insistent language about the non-human world. Timon's speeches abound with references to worms, toads, wolves, and all manner of beasts, but especially dogs. Inspired by this suggestion, I learned more about a famous stray dog that lived for nearly 17 years around the Berkeley pit, with hideously dreadlocked fur and heightened levels of arsenic in his system. Called the Auditor, this misshapen canine has become a sort of mascot of Butte, an emblem of environmental degradation, but also a testimony that it is possible to endure. In our production, the dog belongs first to Epaminondas, then lives with Timon in the wilderness, and finally survives as a reminder of the toxins that we all carry within us. The fundamental aim of the stage production was to immerse the story in particular outdoor locations that were not natural so much as post-industrial, thereby highlighting our position in the Anthropocene. The performance at Butte took place at the Foreman's Park at Mountain Con Mine Yard. The landmark mining headframe here bears the slogan, "Mile High, Mile Deep," a testimony to the mine that ran here for 60 years and then was abandoned for another 30 before being opened as a remediated public park in 2012. From this site, one can see the Berkeley pit, dozens of headframes, historic uptown Butte, and the rich lands on which these human structures have been built. When the play refers to the opulence of Butte, the actors were able to gesture toward the early 20th century homes of its heyday, many of which still stand in the historic district. More striking was the expansive presence, impossible to ignore, of the Berkeley pit. In many ways, this pit seems like a graveyard, a chasm of death, a reminder of a forgotten past. Not far from Foreman's Park, however, excavators are still running, belying the common belief that just because the Berkeley pit no longer operates, the mining industry is defunct. More hopefully, like Timon of Anaconda as an artistic work, this Butte Park is a site of mining reclamation. It provides a place for public gatherings amongst walking and biking trails through newly planted native grasses, while also maintaining interpretive signs that educate visitors about the complex legacy of this region. The Bozeman performance of Timon of Anaconda took place at the dilapidated Story Mill silos and was therefore further removed from the adaptation's language in terms of direct Butte references. But this post-industrial site nevertheless allowed for evocative connections to related histories. The Story Mill grain terminal was constructed in 1882. It was the largest elevator in Montana at that time and was a powerful economic force in the region. The Story Mill ceased operating in the late 1960s, but it remains an iconic structure in northeast Bozeman. The city has recently opened the large Story Mill Park next to these silos, dedicated to the revitalization of the industrial site for use by the community, along with the restoration of wetlands to enhance the animal population. Both sites evoked the material reminders of the many factors involved in telling an environmental history, echoing the adaptation's concern with the human and non-human costs of industrialization, but also the possibilities of restoration and stewardship. Timon of Anaconda's protagonist dies off stage as he does in the original, after carving his own misanthropic epitaph. But when the steward announces Timon's death and hands the epitaph to Alcibiades, written on a piece of tree bark, the foreman does not show any great interest in Timon's passing. He glances at the epitaph, but then distractedly discards it and returns to the city. In this devastated landscape, the steward reflects upon the horrible resting place for her master, gesturing toward the Berkeley pit when saying, "Dead then, and this his grave." She picks up the epitaph again and delivers the final speech of the play, which evokes a sense of mourning that extends from the ruined miner to the prospective catastrophe that threatens the CPA site. Though he abhorred in us our human griefs, scorned our brains' flow, and those our droplets which from frugal nature fall, yet rich conceit taught him to make the rising water weep on his low grave, on faults forgiven. This speech suggests an agency in nature, which is able to rebuke, yet mourn for, and ultimately reclaim the humans who have injured it. The script's reference to rising water evokes the continued and increasing problem of the sludge that cannot be held back by the dams indefinitely. This imagery also globalizes this local catastrophe, thereby making Timon an Anthropocene everyman, in a pit of his own making as the waters rise around him. After delivering this speech, the steward was joined by two of Timon's former servants, who hugged her in a spirit of sorrow and loss. She signals to these young people that they must now clean up the wreckage. Dead geese props had been preset, in a clear allusion to the multiple incidents of snow geese dying when they landed on the pit's acidic water. But there was also garbage on the ground. Some was preset, but other items turned out to be a byproduct of the audience that came to watch a performance in an outdoor location. The servant gathered some pieces of trash along with the geese, then returned to the steward. At that moment, the dog came on stage alone. When the steward and other servants reached out to touch the haggard animal, they accepted the offspring of the Anthropocene as part of moving toward a sustainable future.
This ending was not meant to be naively redemptive, but to assert that we all contain the toxic byproducts of mining, and thus all share in the poison, but also in the solutions. The steward and his fellow servants were poised to consider a new way of operating in the world, one that takes full measure of the earth and resists destructive anthropocentrism. By ending with the steward and this tone, Timon of Anaconda acknowledges the shared guilt of Butte's past, but also gestures toward potential futures that require forgiving faults, even egregious ones that create environmental catastrophe. With ecological systems of thought that are grounded upon reclamation, perhaps we can stop the obsessive practice of digging our own graves.